For nearly all of human history, a wolf outside your camp at night was not company. It was a death threat. If you were standing at the edge of an ice age fire roughly 30,000 years ago, a wolf pack circling in the dark had better night vision than you, a better sense of smell than you, and jaws built to bring down animals many times its own size. And out of every dangerous, unpredictable animal sharing that landscape, that exact predator is the one humans ended up letting sleep in the same shelter. Not the deer, not the horse, not anything remotely safer to be near. The wolf. Right now, somewhere in the hundreds of millions, possibly close to a billion, dogs are alive on this planet. They sniff out cancer in hospitals, pull sleds across frozen tundra, guide people who cannot see, and occasionally refuse to come inside because a squirrel looked at them wrong. None of that was the plan. No Ice Age Council ever gathered to vote on breeding a four-legged smoke detector that also enjoys belly rubs. This entire relationship was never actually designed. It happened by accident. And the part that tends to get flattened into a single tidy story is that wolves may have started that process on their own, before any human ever decided to help it along. Though researchers studying exactly how this happened do not all agree on the details. If you want the version of this where even the famous eye contact bonding study turns out to have a real, documented flaw in it, this channel does one of these every week. Stick around, because dog domestication is not actually the single, settled story most retellings make it sound like. Start with the disagreement itself, because it rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. Researchers studying how wolves became dogs generally split into two camps. One camp argues for self-domestication, the idea that bolder, calmer wolves began scavenging at the edges of human camps on their own initiative, gradually adapting to human presence without any deliberate human involvement at all. The other camp argues that early humans played a more direct, active role, deliberately capturing wolf pups from dens and hand-raising them, which would have produced tame individuals far faster than passive scavenging alone could explain. Both camps have real evidence behind them, and the honest answer is that the field has not fully settled. Which mechanism, or what combination of the two, actually happened first? It is worth understanding why this particular disagreement has proven so hard to resolve, because it is not simply a matter of researchers refusing to compare notes. Both hypotheses predict a broadly similar end result: a wolf population that gradually becomes calmer, more tolerant of humans, and eventually genetically distinct from wild wolves, which means the archaeological and genetic evidence available today often fits comfortably under either explanation. Distinguishing between a slow, passive filtering process and a faster, more deliberate one requires evidence about behavior and intention that simply does not fossilize well tens of thousands of years later. Researchers are left interpreting bones, teeth, and DNA for a process that may have looked completely different depending on which specific human population, in which specific region, is actually being studied. The self-domestication version works something like this. Ice Age humans left behind bones, skins, and half-eaten carcasses, effectively turning every camp into a standing buffet for any animal willing to get close. Wolves that approached carefully and tolerated human presence got fed. Wolves that attacked got speared. Wolves that stayed too fearful and distant simply missed out on free calories entirely. Over many generations, that repeated filtering process would have favored individuals with calmer, less reactive temperaments, animals more comfortable existing near humans without either fleeing or fighting. That kind of filtering does not require any conscious cooperation on either side to work. A wolf does not need to understand what a human camp is, and a human does not need to understand what natural selection is, for calmer wolves to simply end up eating more consistently and surviving in greater numbers than their more reactive relatives. Proponents of this hypothesis often point out that the process resembles how urban foxes, coyotes, and other wildlife have adapted to modern cities without any deliberate human breeding program at all, animals gradually shifting their behavior around a human-dominated environment purely because the individuals best suited to that environment simply survive and reproduce more successfully than the ones that are not. The active rearing hypothesis tells a more deliberate story instead. Human hunter-gatherers occasionally encountered wolf dens, and orphaned or captured pups raised by hand from a very young age tend to imprint strongly on whoever raises them, becoming far more comfortable around people than an adult wolf ever could. If early humans regularly did this, intentionally or simply out of curiosity, That alone could have produced tame, people-oriented wolves considerably faster than a slow scavenging filter working across dozens of generations. Supporters of this version point to ethnographic evidence from more recent hunter-gatherer and traditional societies, where hand-rearing wild animal pups, not just wolves, but occasionally other young mammals as well, has been documented as a fairly common practice, sometimes for practical reasons, and sometimes seemingly out of simple curiosity or attachment. If early Ice Age humans behaved similarly, even occasionally, a single successfully raised, unusually tame wolf integrated into a human band could have produced tame offspring far more quickly than waiting on a purely passive scavenging filter to slowly shift an entire wild population's average temperament over dozens of live generations. Whichever mechanism came first, and it is entirely possible both processes happened simultaneously in different populations. The underlying biology behind what happened next is where things get genuinely interesting. In 1959, Soviet geneticist Dmitry Belyayev began a long-running experiment in Siberia, breeding silver foxes for exactly one trait: tameness and nothing else. Each generation, he selected only the calmest, least aggressive foxes to breed forward. Within a few decades, those foxes were behaving remarkably like dogs, wagging their tails, seeking out human attention, tolerating handling that would have triggered aggression in earlier generations. But Belyaev had not selected for any of that directly. He had only ever selected for calm behavior around people. It is worth appreciating how disciplined this experiment actually was, because the result depends entirely on that discipline. Each generation, Belyaev's team tested fox kits for their reaction to a human approaching, reaching toward them, and handling them directly, scoring each animal's fear and aggression response, then breeding forward only from the calmest scoring individuals in the entire population. No animal was trained. No animal was taught tricks or rewarded for specific behaviors. The only thing selected across generation after generation was the animal's underlying emotional reaction to a person standing nearby, which makes everything that changed afterward, in temperament and eventually in appearance, a direct, traceable consequence of that one narrow selection pressure rather than any broader training program. What happened to their bodies is the part that genuinely surprised researchers. Without anyone deliberately breeding for appearance, the tamer foxes began developing floppy ears, shorter snouts, curled tails, and patches of white fur. Physical traits nobody had selected for on purpose. Researchers studying this pattern across multiple domesticated species now refer to it as domestication syndrome, a cluster of physical changes that appears to emerge as an automatic side effect of selecting purely for reduced fear and aggression, likely tied to how certain cells involved in both temperament and physical development originate from the same tissue very early in an embryo. The proposed biological explanation traces back to a group of embryonic cells called neural crest cells, a population of cells present very early in development that eventually migrates outward and contributes to an unusually wide range of finished structures, including parts of the adrenal system involved in fear and stress responses, along with cartilage in the ears, pigment cells in the skin and fur, and structures in the face and skull. Researchers have proposed that mild reductions in neural crest cell activity could simultaneously produce calmer, less reactive animals, and, as a side effect, the exact physical package domestication syndrome describes: floppier ears, patchier coloring, and softer facial structure, all traceable back to one shared developmental origin point rather than separate, independently selected traits. This detail matters enormously for the wolf debate specifically, because it means the physical transformation from wolf to dog did not require anyone to plan it, regardless of which domestication hypothesis you favor. Whether wolves tamed themselves gradually through scavenging, or whether early humans sped the process up by hand-raising pups, both pathways run through the same underlying biological shortcut. Select for calm behavior, and floppier ears, shorter snouts, and curlier tails come along for free, without a single generation of deliberate breeding aimed at appearance. Once tamer wolves were sticking closer to human settlements, the practical benefits would have become obvious fairly quickly. Wolves detect danger long before humans typically do, hearing distant movement, smelling approaching predators, noticing strangers well before a sleeping camp would otherwise wake. A wolf lingering near a fire functioned as an early warning system, and one that also occasionally helped locate nearby prey, reacting to an approaching threat well before any human sentry would have noticed anything at all. Genetic and archaeological evidence generally places dogs as the earliest domesticated animal in human history, arriving well before sheep, goats, or farming itself, which makes the relationship considerably older than agriculture rather than a byproduct of it. That timing detail carries real weight for both domestication hypotheses discussed earlier, since either mechanism had to be underway well before humans had settled villages, stored grain surpluses, or any of the other infrastructure usually associated with animal domestication in general. Sheep, goats, cattle, and other domesticated species largely followed the rise of farming, tied to fixed settlements with enclosures and stored feed available to manage them. Dogs did not have any of that scaffolding available. Whatever process tamed the first wolves had to work inside a mobile, hunter-gatherer existence, without pens, without stored surplus grain, and without any of the practical infrastructure that made every other domestication story considerably more straightforward. Agriculture did leave its own mark on dogs later, though, once farming eventually spread. Researchers studying dog genetics have identified specific expansions in a gene called AME2B, which helps break down starch, present at much higher copy numbers in dogs than in wolves. That genetic difference lines up closely with the shift toward grain-heavy human diets that followed the spread of farming, suggesting dogs continued adapting to whatever humans were eating long after the initial relationship had already formed. It is a small, easily overlooked detail, with a surprisingly current echo, since debates over how much grain belongs in a modern dog's diet are, in a real sense, still circling the same evolutionary adaptation researchers can trace directly back to this period. Modern pet food marketing has, at times, leaned hard into the idea that dogs are essentially wolves in a costume, better served by grain-free, meat-heavy formulas that supposedly match some pure ancestral diet. The starch digestion research complicates that pitch considerably. Dogs are not simply wolves that happen to tolerate living indoors. Their digestive systems carry a specific, measurable genetic adaptation to eating starchy food that wolves largely lack. Evidence of thousands of years spent adjusting to whatever humans were actually eating and sharing, grain included. That does not settle every detail of the modern pet nutrition debate, since individual dogs and individual health conditions vary considerably, but it does undercut the simple version of the marketing pitch that treats any amount of grain as somehow unnatural for the species. The emotional side of the bond is where the popular version of this story tends to state more certainty than the underlying research fully supports. A widely cited 2015 study published in the journal Science reported that when dogs and their owners made sustained eye contact, both released oxytocin, the same hormone strongly associated with parent-infant bonding, and that wolves raised by humans did not show the same reciprocal hormonal response. That finding spread quickly and became one of the most repeated facts in this entire topic. It is worth being precise about a real limitation in that specific study. Since later researchers reviewing the methodology identified a significant confound, the dog owners in the study were disproportionately women, while the wolf handlers were disproportionately men, and existing oxytocin research had already established that women tend to show meaningfully larger oxytocin responses than men across comparable situations. That imbalance makes it genuinely difficult to say with confidence whether the dog versus wolf difference the study reported reflects a real species-level distinction or simply reflects who happened to be holding the leash. The broader idea that dogs and humans share an unusually strong bonding response remains plausible and is supported by other lines of evidence. This specific, frequently cited study is simply not the clean, uncomplicated proof it gets treated as in most retellings. Untangling that kind of confound properly would require running the comparison again with matched groups of male and female owners, handling both dogs and wolves under otherwise identical conditions, controlling for exactly the variable that muddied the original result. As of the most recent published commentary on the topic, that fully controlled version of the experiment does not appear to have settled the question definitively either way. The honest current position is that dogs and humans likely do share some kind of elevated oxytocin response tied to mutual gaze. Since related evidence beyond this one study points in that general direction, but the specific, Tidy claimed that wolves categorically lack this response, repeated constantly across popular science content, rests on a study whose central comparison was not as clean as it first appeared. None of this transformation came free of real cost. Selective breeding aimed at appearance rather than health has left many modern breeds with serious, well documented problems. Flattened faces that restrict normal breathing, elongated spines prone to injury, and body proportions that can make natural birth difficult or impossible without medical intervention. The same process that produced a companion animal capable of forming an extraordinary bond with humans also produced, in some breeds, bodies actively working against their own health, a tension worth naming honestly, rather than skipping past in a story that otherwise sounds entirely heartwarming. None of that history is a reason to view the relationship cynically, but it is a useful reminder that domestication is not a single event that happened once, long ago, and then simply stopped. It has kept running, generation after generation, driven now by deliberate human aesthetic preference rather than ancient survival pressure. And the outcomes of that more recent, purposeful selection have not always served the animals on the receiving end of it nearly as well as the earlier, more accidental process seems to have. Old wolf behavior still surfaces constantly in ordinary dogs too, mostly unnoticed. Circling repeatedly before lying down echoes the flattening of grass or snow a wolf might have done to prepare a resting spot. Burying food, howling at sirens, twitching through vivid dreams, all of it traces back to instincts that predate the entire relationship with humans by a wide margin, sitting quietly underneath thousands of generations of selection for calm, cooperative behavior. Even the modern impulse to bark sharply at an unfamiliar sound, then look immediately back at a nearby person as though checking whether the alert was actually necessary, echoes the same early warning role wolves likely provided at the edge of a camp, long before anyone called that animal a pet. The clearest physical evidence of how deep and how old the emotional side of this relationship actually runs comes from a site in Germany called Bonn Oberkassel, first discovered by chance in 1914 and reanalyzed far more thoroughly by researcher Luke Janssens and colleagues in a study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2018. The grave, dated to roughly 14,200 years ago, contains the remains of a man and a woman, buried alongside not one dog, but two. An older adult animal and a young puppy, roughly 27 to 28 weeks old at the time of its death, discovered originally by chance and then re-examined with far more advanced diagnostic tools nearly a century later. Detailed analysis of the puppy's teeth revealed it had contracted canine distemper at around 19 weeks of age, developing severe dental and gum damage consistent with a serious, prolonged illness. Left untreated, a case of distemper that severe typically kills a dog within about 3 weeks. This particular puppy's dental pathology shows it continued living, and visibly suffering, for roughly 6 additional weeks beyond that window before finally dying. That timeline only makes sense if someone was actively keeping the animal alive, feeding, cleaning, and caring for a sick, likely miserable puppy that offered no practical use to a group of hunter-gatherers during that entire stretch. Consider what that decision actually cost a small Ice Age community operating with genuinely thin margins for survival. Every scrap of food and every hour spent tending a dying puppy was food and time not spent on hunting, foraging, or resting. There was no practical payoff waiting at the end of that care. No guarantee the animal would recover enough to ever earn its keep as a working dog. The choice to keep nursing it anyway, for weeks, is not evidence of a purely transactional relationship built around usefulness. It reads as something closer to attachment, sustained past the point where any cold calculation of costs and benefits would have justified it. Whatever specific mix of pity, affection, or simple companionship motivated that decision, it required someone to make it repeatedly, day after day, for well over a month. The presence of a second, fully grown dog buried in the same grave adds another layer worth sitting with. Whatever role that older animal played in the group's daily life, hunting assistance, guarding, companionship, or some combination of all three, its burial alongside 2 humans and a sick puppy suggests this was not an isolated, one-time act of unusual sentimentality. It points toward dogs already occupying a recognized, valued place within this particular community's understanding of who belonged with them, close enough to be laid to rest inside the same grave reserved for its own dead, A level of inclusion archaeologists rarely find extended to any other animal from this period, in a burial context otherwise reserved specifically for members of the human community itself. So, the honest answer to how humans accidentally created dogs is not the single, tidy narrative most versions of this story settle for. It likely involved wolves gradually filtering themselves through scavenging near human camps, quite possibly alongside a separate, more deliberate thread of humans occasionally raising captured pups by hand, with neither explanation fully ruling out the other. It involved a biological shortcut, visible directly in Belyaev's fox experiment, where selecting purely for calm behavior automatically produced floppier ears, shorter snouts, and curlier tails as an unplanned side effect. It involved genuine, still developing science around the emotional bond itself, including at least one famous, widely repeated study that turns out to rest on shakier methodological ground than its popularity suggests. And it involved real, documented evidence, preserved in the teeth of a sick puppy buried 14,200 years ago, that this relationship crossed from usefulness into something closer to genuine care long before anyone could have written the story down. Nobody ever planned any of it. Somewhere between a scavenging wolf, a hand-raised pup, and a small group of people who could not bring themselves to stop caring for a dying animal that offered them nothing in return, an accident quietly became one of the oldest partnerships our species has ever kept. None of the people at that Ice Age campfire could have known they were founding a relationship that would eventually stretch across every continent through agriculture, through cities, through the invention of writing, and everything that came after it. They were simply looking at an animal in front of them and deciding, for reasons no bone or gene can fully explain, that it was worth the trouble to keep it close. Every dog curled up on a couch tonight is still, in some small and largely unrecognized way, living out the far end of that decision.